Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We are dialing in now to one of our first Eko podcasts. This is a series of discussions across different topics related to remote working, virtual workplaces, things that have come to light since the recent COVID-19 situation. Today's episode is going to be a two-part series where we're going to focus on the topic of building two-way trust in a virtual workspace. We're going to be kicking off today with a focus on how leadership can build authentic trust in the organization whilst everyone's working remotely, so no more in the physical office. My name is Katie Wan, and I'm VP Head of People at Eko. Joining me today is Will Messent, Senior Manager at Kumon UK, and Sandra Rutten, who is Diversity and Inclusion Lead at Inmarsat. So welcome to both of you, Sandra and Will.
Hello.
Hi. So actually, I think today's discussion is going to be incredibly interesting because myself, Will, and Sandra come from very different backgrounds, all of us with a degree of specialisms in HR. Just for a couple of minutes introduction, so that they can explain to you the organization they work for, the type of organization, and actually where they're at, because currently we are talking from 3 different countries. So I'm going to start with Sandra. Over to you.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk about this topic today. I think it's one of my favorites. I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Lead at Inmarsat, which is a global mobile satellite communications company. So we are a multinational company across, I want to say, 42 different locations. We were initially kind of UN originated to help safety at sea, and now we are kind of beyond that in a much more commercial sense and are now privately owned. So I look after diversity and inclusion for our entire global group and as well as engagement. So I am actually in Holland. I got stuck here during quarantine. I'm on my parents' farm, which is not the worst place to be. We've got a lot of nature and a lot of animals to entertain us. So it's not been too bad.
Thank you. And Will?
Yeah, hi Katie, thanks for inviting me on here. I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Will Messent. I'm the Deputy Senior Leader at Kumon Europe and Africa. We're the world's leading provider of supplementary education with over 4 million students worldwide. My background is in HR management. I was also the Learning and Development Manager for Kumon Europe and Africa for a number of years, and I'm now primarily field-based as part of the senior leadership team. We are a franchise organization, which I think adds an extra dimension to what we do. So yes, we've been supporting our staff in this transition to working from home, but we've also all been working to support our franchisees to make that transition from a classroom environment to online study provision. I'm based in Manchester in the north of England, where we are still on full lockdown for the time being.
Brilliant. Thank you both. As I said, I think the different perspectives we bring will really benefit the type of discussions that we have today. There've been many webinars discussing things like how can we best adapt to work from home. I think today we want to go a little bit deeper than that and actually think about organizational resilience, the roles of leadership, but really breaking apart how can senior leads and managers and peers themselves build that degree of trust when you're not there in a physical workspace. For me, as a deeper introduction for everyone, so Eko is actually in the startup community. We actually have an app which we were lucky to use to pivot quickly to work from home. It's actually it's a software that you use to do project work, to be able to chat, communicate. So I think leveraging that in a short period of time was fantastic for us, but still there were many challenges presented to do with how can we still build that trust. So I look forward, Sandra, Will, to opening that up with you today. I think before we actually deep dive into that as well, one thing I do want to acknowledge is beforehand, work from home, it existed, right? I don't know for you guys if you had it in your company as a policy. We had it more like a benefit, actually. So we allowed our staff to have a couple of days a month. If they needed a couple more at the discretion of the manager, they could, but it wasn't a blanket, work from home whenever you wanted. What I find interesting since the COVID-19 situation is that suddenly it's a blanket, everyone is work from home. And that created a very different dynamic. So I'm just wondering quickly, Sandra, Will, what was your company's approach to work from home before COVID-19?
So for us, it was very much in place. We, in the last 2 years, have put a lot of work into creating a kind of more, I want to say, modern HR culture. And with that, we were trying to transition from kind of the presenteeism to an outcomes-based approach to working. And for us, that really meant being able to do work wherever that works for you. So kind of making work for you, making your life-work balance optimal for your particular situation. So last September, we ran a big campaign to make sure that people were encouraged to work flexibly and in kind of any way that makes sense for them. And we've had a really great positive result to that. There were always jobs that can't be done from home. There's satellites to manage, and there's actual kind of operational stuff that cannot be done from home. So that's been a bit of a bigger transition, but those key workers are still in the office. But what I think is also really interesting is that we've always had people who needed to work from home, right? There's been a big group of people with disabilities who've asked to work from home, and that didn't seem to be possible. And I'm not saying that for us as an organization, I'm saying that kind of in a general position. And now all of a sudden, when it's necessary, it seems to be possible for a lot more people. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic to add on to that.
Sure. No, that's a very interesting point, actually. Thank you. How about you, Will, at Kumon?
Yeah, I would say working from home is a relatively rare occurrence for us. The nature of our role is a consultative, very people-focused one, which traditionally has involved being physically present. We go out to our classrooms, our study centres, and we work alongside instructors developing those centres in a very kind of hands-on way. So working from home has been something that we've done from time to time where appropriate, but not as a regular part of working life. So it will be interesting to see to what extent this changes that dynamic within our organisation. One thing I think that has been interesting during this, we've learned a lot about how our staff react to working from home. And one big difference is, of course, in the past, it's been a few hours here and there, maybe a day here and there. Here we're talking about weeks, we're talking about months. And I think that idea of kind of sustainable working from home has become an important factor.
Well, it'll be great to hear from you later then, Will, because to go from it not being the norm to suddenly have to shift very quickly, I can imagine, the topic of trust here, because it's something that the organization maybe is not used to. I'd love to hear later about your views on, were there issues with trusting the workforce, as it were, to suddenly not be visible? So yeah, thank you very much. So let's now pivot into what is the definition of trust in the sense. So before we actually talk about it, I think we should align on what that might mean. I think for many organizations, I've heard, anecdotally from friends, that one of the issues that managers had were, hey, how do we know if they're performing? How do we know that someone's not just having a sneaky extra long lunch break or doing their laundry, hanging out with their family or housemates, whatever it is? And there was a strong focus at the start on, how do we manage it, reporting, etc., etc. We want eyes everywhere, a bit like Big Brother, which I'm not actually saying is the most healthy thing, but that's certainly things that I heard a lot at the start from my peers in the HR network. But interestingly, there are various definitions and various studies have happened to actually show that trust is a fundamental predictor of organizational success. I think some of the ones that we can link to are, for example, Google. They did a research, I'm not sure exactly when, a few years ago, Project Aristotle. And in this, they actually looked at, a fair number of teams across the organization to actually see what made teams successful or not successful. And through that, they actually found that trust was a huge, huge factor. And they actually linked to that the concept of psychological safety. Sandra, is that a term that you've come across before, or what does that mean to you?
I think for me, trust is definitely encapsulated in that construct of psychological safety, right? So there's, it was a construct that had many elements to it, but I think for diversity and inclusion, it's such a key fundamental part to making people feel like they belong, right? If you feel safe to bring your ideas, to be who you are at work, but also to know that you can expect the same from can expect a certain amount of transparency and respect from your organization. That's, I think, the biggest contribution we can give to employees, so that they can contribute their potential back to us, if that makes sense. So we can actually kind of trust them to trust us to deliver in any way that makes sense for them and helps us along in a more productive way.
That's interesting though. So I can understand, you know, a lot of, if you read materials, articles or resources about building trust, you can probably find quite a lot to do with in a physical workspace. Okay, so building on the relations, showing degrees of integrity, just by being physically present. One could argue that it might be easier. So now that we're in a remote workspace, you can't see the person. In terms of making people feel, so with psychological safety, that people can give open and candid feedback on something, that they can make a mistake in something that they do and they're not going to be reprimanded for it, because it should be a learning opportunity. Of course, that's reasonable, not all the time, and the severity of it can't be a huge, you know, gross misconduct. But we want to foster the sense of learning from each other. So in this virtual workspace, what are your thoughts behind how organizations can actually do that successfully?
So I think this is probably the ultimate test of that, right? I think this is such an unprecedented time in our history that we can't deny that we're all learning together, right? So I think everyone can acknowledge the fact that none of us have all the answers to what's going on at the moment and how to best work around things. So I think one big signal of trust is kind of admitting to this, right? Admitting that you might not know everything and that you are all learning. So you can all learn from each other, and you can all learn from kind of the best practice that people are sharing. So what we saw, for example, in the beginning is a lot of people sending out articles and helpful tips and things like that, but also a lot of leaders kind of admitting that they didn't know how to set up a Zoom a Zoom call, or that they had children who come and sit on their laps and, you know, are asking for a snack. And it was kind of like a really human transition. Like it had to kind of happen a little bit organically. And I think if we all gave each other permission to be that way and kind of invite that into the conversation, then I think there's a trust in the human element of the organization. And I think that's also, we'll talk about leadership in a minute, as you just said. I think that's a huge part for leaders to play, to set the tone for trust and engagement and authenticity in this time.
Yeah, I guess that's, I mean, you just said it there. It really does link to the authenticness of it. And I like your point, because it resonates from an Eko perspective as well, in terms of recognizing that we didn't have the answers, and I don't think there was a manual to know exactly how to deal with this. And actually hands up saying, look, we don't have the answers, but we are going to try our best to do it, and we want your feedback to tell us, are we doing the right thing, or is this actually, you know, we're really messing it up and it's not doing what we intended to do. I think having that transparency goes a long way with the staff, and same with the manager body as well. Just to put out there, when we wrote our work from home policy, not the one we had as a benefit, but this new one where everyone was suddenly work from home, you know, I put that together and I had no clue if it was too strong, too light, was it even fruitful in terms of the content. And actually taking this to the managers and saying, guys, you work with the staff, how do you think they'll take it? But also as an employee yourself, how do you take this? Do you feel like we're being too hands off or hands on? And I think being able to then iterate on what we'd written, and to show that actually, yeah, it wasn't a perfect article straight away, and I was willing to change it, it went down a treat, because then that's kind of like trying to set the tone of, you know, same for you. When you do this with your team, you might not get it right, but make sure that you're ready to pivot and not be stuck in a way of, I've got the answers. So yeah, I really, really resonate with that. So thanks for your point.
And I think as you've done there, Katie, to acknowledge those ambiguities and acknowledge that there are these uncertainties here. I think the flip side of that is that in a low trust environment, you might feel kind of paralyzed. You might feel you can't share that lack of knowledge, that lack of certainty. which may lead to inaction. It may lead to inertia, which obviously is the last thing any business wants at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I couldn't think of anything worse, that people feel that they, can't speak up and you can't see anybody. So you just assume naturally, well, if you don't hear anything, that's good news, right? There's a saying similar to that. And I think in this case, that's really not the case. No news is very much bad news. I think anyway. But Will, coming back to you. So as you said, your organization traditionally didn't have work from home purely because of the work you do. It wasn't something that was the norm. So now that it is, how have you and your managers kind of tried to build a sense of trust with your employees?
Okay, so I think there's an important role for leadership here. There is no such thing as over-communication in a crisis. And even as we've just said, frequent communication has been really important, even if that's imperfect to some extent. So we have looked to be as clear as we can. So I think there's a role for us to kind of cut through the noise to a certain extent and offer a clarity of direction as far as is possible. We've tried to show empathy as well, and I think that's a really important ability for leaders to have in this time, to allow staff to feel comfortable expressing their doubts, their concerns as well, and to keep this connection going. Yeah, because without these regular communications, we end up with this vacuum.
No, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned a little bit there about imperfect communications. What do you mean by that?
Well, I guess that's comes back to the point that we don't have the answers. We're living in a very, very fast-changing set of circumstances with a lot of ambiguity. And if we are waiting until we've got certainty, it's going to lead to this sense of paralysis, this sense of inertia. So to be able to communicate, to be able to acknowledge those ambiguities and do the best we can, and realize that we're going to make mistakes. And own those mistakes, own those decisions, and use them as a learning point and show humility through this process, I think can be really important.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, Sandra alluded to a sense of being humble, and you've talked about humility. I think sometimes it's, there are managers or, leadership teams who may want to feel that they have all the answers because they're looked to as, we should be the ones that people come to get through the crisis. So it's suddenly to actually not be in that position, but say that that's okay, can actually feel quite vulnerable from a manager's perspective, which is something which other managers need to support managers to do. HR team members need to support managers, and managers support HR managers with it as well, because feeling vulnerable is not easy, actually.
Yeah, but I think the other role for HR there is how could we future-proof our leaders a little bit, right? So if we acknowledge that actually crisis requires competence, and I think we see that in many different kind of world stages at the moment. We know that we have to get our leaders or future leaders. We have to give them support to be prepared for this, right? Or to kind of have the skills to talk through this. So you do have this kind of future demand for this competence in your leader, and also preparedness for kind of quick decision making in a world where you don't have a lot of answers, where you might have missing information, and still doing what might be kind of commercially difficult, or even difficult when it comes to dealing with a huge group of people that are looking to you for answers. So I think the role of leaders is it has to shift now, right? Like it's obviously shifting at the moment, but I think it's also going to require something different in the future. I think it needs to shift kind of beyond just this current shape of the crisis to dealing with the aftermath and actually preparing for the future.
It's interesting because, now that we have the beauty of hindsight, and as you said, maybe we need to shift our mindset for the future. This time it was COVID, but there could be something totally different that knocks us 6 months down the line or 2 years down the line. And I wondered, just as a rhetorical question, if leadership and manager training, which I think has, you look at agendas or curriculums for such trainings, they often have very similar topics from one company to the next, or the vendors. But I wonder if there's going to be a big drive towards modules that really look at dealing with big unknowns. and the mindset that's needed, and the resilience in people's thinking to be able to persevere through that, which is a very different skill set of just learning of how to deal with people, EQ and your typical leadership topics, conflict management, etc. So we should watch the market for that. It'll be interesting.
I mean, you two are both leaders of big teams. Are there skills that you've had to come up now or kind of learn quickly as you've had to shift here? Because you must have had to shift the way that you work, or shift the things that you've had to learn quickly, right? There must be, what do you wish you'd have known before this, I guess?
I think for me, there's been a few things that have cropped up. Whether I could have known it before then, I'm not sure, but there's a few things that I've had to adapt to really quickly. I think one of those is around ambiguities and really giving clarity where you can. So I think as a leader, there are certain things you can give. You can give clarity on boundaries, on working hours, response times, activity. I think you can, there's been a need also to look at how to work with, how different people on the team will react to working from home. We're working in an environment with 4 generations in the workplace, and that's going to provoke a lot of different responses to this sudden pivot to working from home. And it requires leaders to be flexible on that. And I think there's also those more creative options to maintain a sense of belonging. So I know lots of different teams are doing virtual team drinks, online yoga, those kind of activities. You just have to work that bit harder to make sure that team spirit is being built during this time.
Just to add to that, one of the things that I would say, I don't think we've been able to pivot quickly to put in trainings to support managers, but one area that I've noticed is something that I would want to focus on, because I've seen managers have to use this skill set more than ever in my career so far, and that's actually a degree of EQ and being able to truly elicit if there are issues, or if someone wants to talk about something, actually persevering through and not just going, hey Will, how are you? And he goes, oh, I'm good, I'm okay. Oh, great, so you must be good. In my mind, I've asked you and you're fine. I think it takes a little bit more than that. Sure, he may be fine, but just be able to creatively ask questions just to double check that actually, if I ask a different way, maybe it'll elicit a different response, to truly understand where he's at. Because I think loneliness, these are issues, mental well-being, these are issues, just generally being able to advise employees on how to structure their day. We have a lot of millennials as well who are first-time jobs, maybe they've been working for just a few months, and for them to pivot to work from home without having really experienced work before is quite difficult. They might not openly tell us that, or they might not even recognize that. So again, the managers being able to hone in on those points without seeming intrusive, without seeming micromanaging, is actually, I think it's an art to being a manager. So yeah. Anyway, let me just quickly bring to a close on this point about trust, and just say that I think there's been a lot of research done into the impact of trust, as I mentioned before, but in terms of the outcome it can have. So Paul Zak, as an example, is a researcher in neuroscience, and he actually showed that a culture of trust does lead to hard, better business outcomes. So examples of this are 74% less stress, 106% more energy at work, 50% higher productivity, 13% fewer sick days, and 76% more engagement. And that's only just a handful of some of the statistics and data that they were able to derive. So I think in itself, all those HR managers or senior they're hearing that, hopefully that that will convince you, if not already, that putting in time to really build on trust across the organization is worthwhile. All right, so that brings us to the end of part 1. I'm really excited to deep dive further on communication in part 2. So thank you, Will, thank you, Sandra, and see you in session 2. Bye, everyone.